himself about the two books, and look forward to having a discussion with you afterwards, Michael.
Thanks so much, Ilva. I'm not sure whether I'm supposed to be using both of these. I can put this one down? Yeah. So we're fine with... Okay. Great. I suppose I can put this off. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for attending. I really do appreciate it. It's really great to look out and see a full room. I'm hoping that has something to do not with necessarily my books, but with the importance of the topics that we're here to discuss. We live in probably one of the most complex societies in the world. I know this chap who is from Australia. He's doing some really fascinating research. And those of you who are in academia and do research will understand when I tell you how broad this is. He's taking a look at the dispossession of First Nations by royal charter companies in the primary Anglophone settler societies of the world. So Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the United States, and Canada. So that's one heck of a spread of work that this guy is doing. And he says out of all of the countries that he's worked in, and he has already done some preliminary work in South Africa, he said by far South Africa is the most complex society because you have multiple layers of dispossession. I guess before we get into the primary themes of the books, one of the areas in which I think we have been quite frequently dispossessed as a people is our own history. There's this tendency, even amongst, I find it very bizarre, that is amongst anthropologists today, to claim that Africans essentially lived in some sort of idyllic, Edenic situation before the Europeans arrived, that they almost didn't fight over anything, including girlfriends. Now, I know that's funny, but it's also very serious. It means that there's a strand in academia today that is actually trying to deprive Africans of their sense of agency, of their ability to be actors in their own landscape, okay? And yet when we look at Africa through a proper lens, we see that, for instance, the Kingdom of Benin, the great defensive walls of Benin, stretch further than the Great Wall of China, okay? That King Musa of Mali, even in adjusted dollars today, would be the wealthiest man that's ever lived on the planet. So our notion of Africa has been stolen from us quite often. Okay, our notion of our own history has been stolen. So a lot of what we need to be doing, and a lot of what I guess the decolonization debate is about recapturing a true history of ourselves in all of our complexity, because we are, as my friend pointed out, a very complex society. The overarching narrative of transformation in South Africa, the dominant narrative, I guess you could call it the rainbow trajectory. Okay, we all know that. We've either lived through it, or we've been intimately involved with it, politically, or in the media, or elsewise. Maybe just sometimes as on the receiving end, sometimes just sort of as an ordinary citizen. But we all know what that trajectory is about. The tale of the ultimate triumph of good over evil. It's a beautiful morality tale, of course. The ascension of the African National Congress to power, and of course the ultimate triumph, not just of the ANC, but of all of the liberation movements, ZAPO, PSC, etc. Okay? In at least achieving their first milepost goal, which was the defeat of essentially the last white supremacist state in the world. Okay, and I say the last because we weren't the only one. There were many other countries also operated on a very similar basis. Australia had a white Australia policy that you're possibly aware of that operated from the 1930s into the 1970s, and actually under the United Nations Convention on the Crime of Genocide, 1949, the removal of Aboriginal children from their parents and their forced assimilation into white culture in Australia under this white Australia policy constitutes genocide. So Australia was committing genocide into the 1970s. Okay, so we were not the only country with this warped development. And I think that's important. We're not all South Africans in this room. My perspective as a result, because of my travels and my history, tends to be more regional and transnational. And certainly as an amateur historian, you find that the most interesting new histories are transnational histories. The histories of not just of borderlands and margins and migration, but transnational histories where the old nationalist certainties, particularly of the colonial era boundaries, fall away. They don't fall away completely, of course, because they constitute a particular reality. But the ways in which we are reinterpreting our histories become a lot more holistic, a lot more interpenetrated with, well, what's going on in our neighborhood. You can't interrogate a South African identity even without somehow trying to interrogate, well, how does it relate to migrant labor in particular? Because we're a country built on migrant labor. And how does that play into the so-called xenophobia? Okay, and again, under the Genocide Convention, a lot of the actions and statements made during these so-called xenophobic pogroms in 2008 and earlier last year, in fact, under the convention, constitute the crime of genocide. So, we have a dominant narrative, a great morality tale, very moving, very beautiful. Many, many books, films, etc. have been produced about this. However, Malaika Wazania made a very pertinent comment. You might know her. She's a young South African polemicist, very smart young lady. She wrote quite a controversial piece late last year, essentially saying, Mandela didn't free me. Okay? I was freed by huge unsung masses of ordinary South Africans who put their shoulder to the wheel, okay, and who maybe didn't wind up on Robben Island, although some of these guys were murdered by death squads and disappeared, and we've forgotten about them, okay? It doesn't need to be a Stanza Bopape, it could be somebody else whose name isn't known or isn't resonant, okay? And there's still very many people missing. There's a suggestion by the Kulamani support group that number may very well run into several thousands of people who have essentially been disappeared. And when you start to talk in terms like that, you start to talk about death squads and people who had disappeared. Those of you who know a little bit about the history of the Southern Cone of Latin America would automatically start to think about the death squads and the disappearances there. And this is one of the reasons, or one of the framings, I guess, of the first book that Ilva mentioned, Drinking with Ghosts, is to try and relocate the dirty war within the concept of dirty war. Dirty war was essentially often United States-backed so-called anti-terrorism, anti-communist campaigns, okay, mounted in all parts of the world during the end of the Cold War, particularly the 80s, 70s, late 70s through to the late 80s. And in Argentina, the dirty war, as it is explicitly called there, resulted in something like 30,000 people in what is supposedly an incredibly civilized country. Buenos Aires is kind of the Paris of the South, they say, being disappeared, being tortured, murdered, and never found again, essentially. Okay? Mentioning Paris, by the way, let's not forget that in 1961, the secret massacre occurred in the middle of Paris itself. Okay? Something like 600 Algerians were murdered by the police and thrown into the Seine River. Okay? This occurred in the heart of one of the global capitals in the modern era, in the post-war era. It's only about 4 years ago, I think, one of the local municipal mayors was the first, because she was a socialist, I think, was the first time that a mayor had actually even recognized that this massacre had taken place. So Black Lives Matter, well, it's been an issue for a long time. I trace some of the origins of South African terrorism, state terrorism, okay, turned inwards against our own people, to the French. In 1944, there was an uprising in Madagascar, and Madagascar had been taken over during the Second World War because Madagascar had sided with the Vichy, who aligned with the Nazis. So the British and the South African forces moved against, and Free French forces moved against Madagascar, and they defeated the Vichy forces in Madagascar. And Madagascar was then supposedly free, right, under the Western democracies who were fighting Nazism. But there was a pro-democratic uprising, a liberation movement uprising in Madagascar. And the Free French authorities, the Free French democratic authorities, loaded up about 40 resistants, 40 of these young liberation movement people, flew them out over the ocean and threw them to their deaths from helicopters. This practice was repeated during the liberation war in Algeria. And then when Algeria was lost, so-called, to France in 1962, a lot of the old nasty guys who'd been involved in that dirty war in Algeria moved to Spain, and many of them wound up in Argentina. So the whole practice that became quite notorious in Latin America, Argentina and Chile in particular, of taking activists out and throwing them into the ocean from aircraft so their bones would never be found. Remember, in Argentina alone, 30,000 people disappeared. 30,000, okay? And very few remains have been found. Now, apartheid South Africa, very close friends with these nasty regimes in the southern cone of Latin America. And guess what? From 1978 through till about 1987, we conducted about, several score of death flights in which we took SWAPO prisoners of war, we drugged them, and we dumped them in the South Atlantic Ocean. 200 people disappeared, okay? Not a single person has ever successfully been prosecuted for this. It is the apartheid state's greatest war crime. Not a single person has ever been successfully prosecuted. Not a single victim has ever been named. SWAPO has no interest in itself, and I've been speaking to a former PLAN, that's a People's Liberation Army of Namibia Special Forces operative, and he says, look, my own party has no interest in opening that can of worms because we've got our own things that we did back in the day, our own dirty deeds. And so basically there's this kind of quid pro quo amongst the bad guys in the region. Okay, we think we know everything that went down. If you haven't heard about the SWAPO 200, it's because it wasn't even known at the time of the Truth Commission. Okay? So, how much do we really know about the apartheid past? There was a very important article that came out in the last week in Business Day, saying, what about the long tail of apartheid's corruption, the damage done by apartheid? And they named a whole bunch of cases which are quite well known to older journalists such as myself, right? The Kumliabin Commission that took a look at ivory trafficking, the killing of elephants and rhino, etc., and ivory trafficking and wildlife trafficking by the old SADF, and more, Swiss slush funds and secret bank accounts, and held by the president and the prime minister and all the rest, which was a post that we had back then. There's a lot that we actually still don't know, but we think that we know it. And these things, these are ghosts that continue to haunt us, which is why the overarching theme between these two books, and there are several others, and maybe I'll just conclude my little introduction by just highlighting those themes. But the overarching theme is one of continuity rather than change. We all know that there's been an incredible amount of change in the society. South Africa today, politically, when you take a look at the current situation around the Constitutional Court ruling, etc., is very different to what it was already at the beginning of the year. It's a very rapidly moving society. Okay, so we tend to forget, with so much happening, that there's also a lot of structural continuity, and this is what the decolonization debate is really around. Okay, how come nothing really was changed? How come Mandela didn't have the guts to challenge certain institutions? Why wasn't a certain cabal that essentially amounts to a criminal syndicate overthrown? Is this corruption new? No. Business Day article makes it very clear, fortunately, that this is a continuity of bad old practices, but we never properly cleaned house. Okay, so continuity, and in the midst of change, an overarching theme. The second book, which we're primarily kind of focusing on here tonight, although launching both of them and selling all 4 of my books, is grounded in the colonial era, because A Taste of Bitter Almonds is about conditions of exclusion in democratic South Africa. So it's my field notes as a journalist over 21 years, where I came across stories that I thought were quite resonant and quite telling of where we were as people. So for instance, many years ago, I went down one of the gold mines called West Driefontein in Carltonville. And I was writing a story about the first group of miners who were being trained together, blacks and whites, okay, where the color bar was supposedly no longer extant, okay. I did this for the Sunday Times. I can't even remember the date, but it was a long time ago. And 9 years later, I got myself smuggled back into that same mine through the shop stewards of NUM, National Union of Mine Workers. And I examined I did a comparative study. It's an anecdotal study, really, but I took the life of a black miner and I took the life of a white miner, and I compared them. I took guys who'd both had about a quarter of a century's experience underground, and essentially asking the question, 9 years after integration, does the color bar still exist in the mines? And the difference between these two men's living conditions, earnings and everything else, was dramatic. Okay, the color bar did exist on the mines, and in fact, probably still does. I doubt very much has changed. Okay. Okay, so conditions of exclusion, taking a look at how we continually subdivide ourselves as a people. We've got this terrible habit, I think, as a country. If you've got 5 people in the room, we have to have 5 different tribes, almost, you know, using tribes in the broader sense. It could be anything. It could be politically or ethnically or what have it. But we love subdividing people. And it's a terrible habit that we've internalized apartheid. We actually believe in apartheid. We actually believe that we are completely separate people, and that's why I needed to go back to the colonial era as well, and take a look at, well, where did all this separation and division begin? It's called a taste of bitter almonds because the bitter almond hedge was the first physical racial barrier established by Jan van Riebeck's United East India Company, which we usually call the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, in 1659, during the first war that they'd had with the indigenous people. Okay, it's called the First Dutch Cocoon War, and they actually put up a hedge. And the bizarre thing is, a remnant of that hedge still exists in the Kirstenbosch Gardens today. So it's been quite a hardy little bush. Unfortunately, our habits as South Africans are very much as hardy. We like to maintain those divisions. So I took a look at new research that's coming out that interrogated the differentiations of race and class in the colonial era. And it's quite interesting because although the Cape Settlement was largely a white affair, it wasn't exclusively a white affair. Simon van der Stel, who founded Stellenbosch, he was, well, after whom Stellenbosch was named, he was the first civilian governor of the Cape. When the little military establishment started to expand a bit, they differentiated between a civilian and a military governor. He wasn't a white guy, right? He was partly Bengali, partly Dutch. The fact that he was of mixed race wasn't considered the important thing at the time. The fact that he came from a particular layer of society was the important thing. His class was what was important. Okay, and the function of that class. It's hard to even think of companies today that could approximate something like the VOC. I mean, it would be a multinational company, yes, like Coca-Cola or whatever. But imagine if you had Coca-Cola with its own army, like Blackwater. So Coca-Cola plus Blackwater, okay? That arrogated to itself the right to march into somebody else's country and just seize land, dispossess people, etc. Okay? So the overclass was a bit textured racially, and the underclasses, all of them, the burghers, the free burghers, and all the way down to the slaves, were also very ethnically differentiated. This is not to say that racism did not exist at that time. It clearly did. It was overwhelmingly a European imperialist project. There's no doubt about that. But the underclasses were also very mixed, and there was a degree of mobility. A black slave could become a free burgher. It was possible. On the front cover of the book, actually, you'll see almost like a watermark faintly in the background, the picture of a rather haughty young woman. Her mother was a Bengali slave. The Dutch didn't allow slaves to be brought back into Holland because they didn't want a slave class in Holland. That was meant for the colonies. So what would happen is often on the way back, the ship's captains and all the rest would have to get rid of their own household slaves. And so these slaves got sold on to the local burgers. Her mother, known as Angela of Bengal, or sometimes Maya Angela, was sold with her children to Van Riebeeck, who then passed her on to the military governor. But within a very short period of time, she in fact gained her freedom. And her daughter married exceptionally well. She married Simon van der Stel's best mate, who was the military governor of the Cape, a guy called Olaf Berg, after whom there's now a brandy named, of course. Now she's one of my ancestors. So what I just did in the introduction was I needed to sort of interrogate, well, what is my own family's, where do we fit in the whole colonial dispossession thing? And when we roll forward, in particular, into the 19th century, and this is where my family history gets a little vague because I haven't had the ability to do as much research as I'd like, what is the role of my family in the genocide against the Bushmen? I'm using the term Bushmen very deliberately because I've worked amongst those communities and it's the term they use themselves. As I understand it, the more popular term San is in fact a cocoon pejorative that means vagabond. So I know academics like the term San, but I avoid it like the plague because it's actually rude and the people themselves don't use it. So I will stick with the term Bushman, even though it does sound, it sounds like a pejorative. So it's a bit counterintuitive, but nevertheless, that's what I use in the book. These terms, of course, all shift. At my previous launch of this book last week, one of the guys present was asking, well, what is Bantu? Well, what is any of us? What is white? Are we really what we think we are? Or have we actually accepted apartheid paradigms? I think we've really internalized a lot of stuff. So yeah, the ways in which we like to subdivide ourselves, but the ways in which we like to exclude people. The book is really about conditions of exclusion, so it's kind of everybody who doesn't have a fire pool, okay? No, it really pretty much I don't really deal with the middle classes. I primarily deal with the working classes, the poor, the peasantry. I'm taking a look at land claimants, taking a look at Zama coal miners, people who are on the outskirts. I spend too much of my time as it is in what I call the bubble, which is where the media and academia and the arts and politicians sit and we all shout at each other. And we pay no attention to the rest of the country. So hopefully these are tales, a collection of tales from the rest of the country that we don't actually hear much about in the media. And I'm going to shut up there because I've spoken too long, but thank you. Yeah, it's going to remember I got the thing on.
All right. Oh, that's loud. Is there volume control on? It's good. Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very, very much for that, Michael. I think it's always fascinating to hear you talk to the stories that you've investigated and the issues and the streams that you want to investigate. I think there's two things that comes out very, very clearly from both your books that we're launching here tonight, both from Drinking with Ghosts and from A Taste of Bitter Almonds. And that is that there's two streams almost, and they dovetail, but they also sometimes sort of, diverging, converging trajectories in a sense. It's that personal narrative that I talked about when I introduced you, your story, and that comes through very clearly, I think, in how you, as a young man, and I'm not going to reveal too much of the books because then we'll give it away. But in Drinking with Ghosts, the book actually starts off with you as a young man doing military service, stumbling on a story, quite literally, hey? In A Taste of Bitter Almonds, as you say, there are elements of tracing your own history or narratives of, and that is then coupled up against the backdrop of South African history, that you start off very much sort of a history-based narrative about the apartheid dirty wars in Drinking with Ghosts. In Taste with the Bitter Almonds, you're sort of taking almost that narrative further in to more modern times and more recent history and what's going on in South Africa right now, with a bit of history mixed in as well. Would you say that in terms of firstly marrying these two narratives, is there sometimes, firstly, maybe I should start to take one question at a time. Firstly, do you think that it's important that we know our history in order to move forward and knowing how to structure our future?
Well, look, every historian, and I'm an amateur historian essentially, would say obviously, history is crucially important. Most politicians would say the same. But of course, history is a slippery beast. It's not a fixed entity. It's even though there are facts, there are certain things that happened. Patrice Lumumba was murdered, etc. But the interpretations around this can be very diverse. And this is, of course, where politicians like to play fast and loose with the facts, and obviously highlight certain things and suppress others. I mentioned at the last launch that it may be useful to conceive of the rise of the Zulu kingdom under Shaka and the resultant Mfukane/Difukane as a localized but nevertheless very distinctly imperialist project. Because why should we deny Africans the agency of imperialism? Or are Africans only ever victims? Okay. Unfortunately, with Rwanda, we know that Africans can be genocidaires as well. They can be perpetrators as well as victims. So I think we need to snap out of that binary. We need to give Africans back their agency, or at least show them that their agency does exist, and certainly it existed historically, but that it's very nuanced. It's not a straightforward tale. Our first military submarine, bought under the strategic arms purchase, that is the controversial arms deal, S101, is named after Queen Mantatisi of the Patlokwa. I think the historical evidence seems to be quite clear, is that she embarked on an extermination campaign against Bushmen in her hinterland. Does that automatically mean that she's a bad person? Well, being genocidal is a bad thing, but that's not her entire story, of course. Being a female military leader of an African tribe is very significant. This is not unique, of course. There are many other cases in the region, in particular Madagascar, Angola, etc., where there were female military leaders that fought against neighboring tribes and, of course, against European imperialism. But yes, we need a much more holistic understanding. History is an ongoing dialogue, and we need to dig more deeply into it. The impetus behind the integration of personal narrative in the two books are quite different. The Taste of Bitter Almonds, as I've said, is very much about saying, almost taking a leaf out of Rian Malan's book in My Trader's Heart, saying, well, in what way is my own family responsible for dispossession in this country? What sort of function did we play within settler colonialism as a family? Whereas in Drinking with Ghosts, it was more saying, okay, this is by walking you through my explorations as a journalist, from being a very young and ignorant journalist to somebody who hopefully knows a little bit more. by giving you that narrative, it helped you walk in my shoes and learn along the same sort of path that I learned. So slightly different reasons for why I did that in both books, but yeah.
I want to come back to the personal narrative as well, but just a follow-up question on this idea of sort of, do we know to know our past to be shape our future? There are a lot of interlinkages here. I don't know. It's a little bit of a glitch. Hope you can hear me. There are a lot of interlinkages with the TRC, and you just mentioned the fact that actually a lot of these stories weren't known by the time of the TRC, and the question is then, what would they have come up unless we did some investigations and where the journalists have picked up on certain stories and so forth. Do you also think that some of the stories that you have covered are things that should have been dealt with to a greater depth at the TRC, and there are stories that we did know, facts that we sat on that were never dealt with?
Well, before we even get to that, we need to recognize that there's a huge fund sitting in Jacob Zuma's presidential office that is meant for restitution for victims of apartheid. And this hasn't been paid out yet. It's been a decade now. And that money's been sitting there, hopefully gathering dust and not being used to buy fire pools. But the money is meant to go out to victims of apartheid. Obviously, the whole question of reconciliation and especially recompense is very fraught. Some people find it an insult. Some families, as you know, like the Biko family, etc., distance themselves from the TRC process precisely because of the quid pro quo that was required, saying that amnesty would be granted in exchange for full disclosure. We also know that there are many people who just, including F.W. de Klerk eventually, who eventually said, I'm not collaborating anymore. And to this day, well, there have been no significant legal proceedings against them. They certainly haven't ever been hauled before a court to account for specific actions, whether it was the Caprivi trainees or, who were responsible for the Kwamakuta massacre and all this kind of thing. So there is a whole set of a statutory unfinished business of the TLC, and that is the payments to victims of apartheid. There's a lot of gaps in terms of material that wasn't covered, such as the SWAPO 200. Then there's a lot of, I guess, political gaps, you'd call them, where people, for various reasons, either because they were perpetrators or because they didn't like the framing of the TRC process, stayed outside the process. And so certainly individual cases have never been adequately dealt with. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that, Michael. I think it's interesting. I mean, of course, your books go much wider than the idea of gross human rights violations that the TRC dealt with, and there are many other issues that have, lived with us for a long time as well, such as the arms deal, for example, and nuclear deals and so forth, which I think is very, very interesting. And I'm worried about saying too much. We've had book launches here where we said way too much and we've given away the contents of the books. I think there's a lot of criticism against that. But no, I want to come back to, we can talk a little bit more about that as well. I want to come back to this idea of the personal narrative. I think it's interesting. You mentioned Ria Malan and My Traitor's Heart. I think your books are very, very different, Michael, and this is not a critique to any other personal narratives, but I think that you have a less growling voice as a white male, and as I said, your first book starts off with you as a young military conscript, and I think it's quite interesting the sort of insights that you are gaining. But I don't think that you ever set it out in the way of trying to ever distance yourself or juxtapose your whiteness against something else, or trying to make any trying to, I think you're trying to understand yourself rather than your whiteness, in a sense, in relation to the stories that you cover, the country that you're born into, the idea of a South African history and a future.
One of the things that I've grown to do in subsequent years is train journalists. In particular, one of my passions is training journalists in covering conflict and transitional societies. South Africa is a perfect grounding. Well, certainly having gone through the transition in South Africa is a perfect grounding in that. But I've done this sort of training for journalists in Egypt, in South Africa, in Mexico, in the United States, and also in the Solomon Islands in the South Pacific, where they had a little war between the two of the main islands. And in fact, Archbishop Tutu initiated a truth commission there. And I went along to help out the journalists in interrogating the Truth Commission. And for me, it's become incredibly important for journalists to interrogate their own prejudices and to recognize what their own function is within a conflicted society. I'm really not in these books, and I hope it doesn't come across that way, trying to put myself at the center of the story. I try to use myself as an articulating tool within the thing. The voice that comes across is hopefully a plurality of voices, and they're actually the voices of my interviewees more than myself. I'm very much an old school journalist in this regards, to be honest. I know the benighted young colleagues in my profession are now required to tweet and to be personalities and all this kind of thing, which is completely counterintuitive to me as a journalist. I think the journalists themselves should never be the story. However, I do think one of the good things in the new trend is that audiences are starting to interrogate why journalists make particular decisions. They recognize that now we have some sort of editorial triage. When we're out in the field, we decide that's exciting and that's dull, so we're going there. Okay, why is that exciting and that dull? People are asking those questions. Why did you ignore that story? Because actually, to us, that's an important story. Yes, it doesn't have all the bling that story does, but that to us is an important story. So I think the ways in which journalists are now being challenged and asked to tell the backstories about how did you do that investigation? Why did you make this ethical choice there? Why did you name so-and-so? Why did you go after that person and not that person? Why did you balance things in a particular way? Why did you write a story in a particular way? When I came back from covering the war in Lebanon in 2006, I got chowed out by the Jewish community saying, we were kind of unhappy with your coverage. So I had to sit down with some of these guys and say, well, I was located in Lebanon. I was on the receiving end of Israeli incoming rockets and bombs and mortars and missiles and all the rest. If I'd been Paula Sleer, who was covering it from the Israeli side, I would have been writing about incoming Hezbollah rockets, etc. So I had to explain myself and say, look, there is a certain narrow focus that war puts you in. Anyway, that's just as an example. I don't want to go too deeply down that road because that's not really in these books in any case. But I do think it's important that journalists are now getting interrogated by their audiences around what you would call the backstory, the whys, and in particularly the ethical decisions made, and why we do the selections, why we do the story selections that we do.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned Lebanon. I mean, you quite literally put yourself in the firing line a couple of times. But of course, what you've done is that you put yourself in the firing line in a completely different way through your books. And these are real investigations. These are real revelations that comes out through your books. What has the reception been? And have you felt that you've been more in the firing line now than through your journalistic writing? Not to say that this isn't journalism. Sorry. Yeah.
Well, it's a collection of journalism. I don't know. It's kind of strange when the type of investigative journalism that I've done has involved some significant undercover work. It's also involved, and by undercover I don't mean creeping around in a trench coat or, you know, whatever, being a spy necessarily, but really just kind of monitoring certain movements and certain events and certain tendencies. And my passion as an investigative journalist was more, I always had a much more sociological look at things. I wanted to know what's going on in my society. I think that there's sufficient journalists who go out there and say, Jacob Zuma must pay back the money. You know, there's enough guys on that story. Okay, I want to know, why are we seeing so much religious building in this country? There's this complete spree of churches and mosques and all these things springing up all over. Some of this is demographic, you know, because now the group areas is broken up. A Muslim community will move into a former Jewish community, and the texture of the community will change, and the Muslim community will require a mosque to meet their spiritual needs. So some of it is purely demographic, but there's something else going on, I think. But nobody's writing about that kind of thing. But that's us. It's who we are. It's what we're doing, right? And you know, some of this involves lots of money. Some of it involves a lot of foreign funding as well. So nobody's really questioning, what is the price tag attached to that? Are people trying to buy our strategic loyalties through religious affiliations? Are we turning to God because we feel like we're a country in crisis? Have we reached a plateau in which we're more comfortable, therefore we're feeling more spiritual? But I'm not seeing that debate. And even in a country that is a very religious country, nobody's talking about something as important as that. It's all about who's shouting at who in the EFF and the ANC, or between the two. Or, you know, that to me is not telling me what's going on in my country. That's telling me what the elite is shouting about. And that's, again, it's in that little bubble that I try to break out of.
It's interesting. I realized that we're going to leave some time to open up for questions and answers as well, and open up to the floor. Just one thing, and I think it ties in quite nicely with what you just said. So on the one hand, there's a sort of, what you're propagating for is that, you know, what's been lost out of journalism is, or a journalistic mission, is that sort of broader sociological inquiry instead of rather picking up on the current story all the time. Which brings me then to my last question. What is it that we need to know? What is the story that we've missed? What is it that we in this room need to know? What is the lost story here, a story that hasn't been covered, that actually talks to the transition and are present the most for you?
I think the one that really kind of consolidates it all for me is the one section in A Taste of Bitter Almonds, where essentially what happened is that James Self, who's a DA MP, proposed a private members bill in Parliament. Okay, you're allowed to do that as an MP, but then the Speaker makes a decision on whether the bill can actually be admitted. And it was a very intriguing bill, and this was several years back, probably about 2007. The suggestion was that a bill would be passed and be enacted that would decriminalize all apartheid-era crimes that are not crimes today. So murder remains murder, but pass law violations in particular. Now, if you are a middle-aged Swana guy, you know, in Polokwane trying to get a job as a security guard, you know, if you've got a pass law violation, that's a criminal offense, okay? You can't get a job as a security guard for a pass law violation. Are you kidding me? Right? So, the kind of violations of those infamous apartheid laws, particularly the petty apartheid ones, just to decriminalize them and to expunge the criminal record of these people's convictions. Okay, Max de Pree, the well-known journalist, cannot go to the United States because he has a terrorism conviction. Okay, now his terrorism conviction was for his writing. He didn't ever place a bomb or anything, right? But he was convicted of terrorism. And because you cannot get into the United States if you have a terrorism conviction, he, despite his very strong and illustrious anti-apartheid career as a journalist, he cannot get into the United States. It's not possible. Okay? The one that really intrigued me, however, was the one that I just thought was the most intimate. And that these were the ways in which people were prosecuted under, first of all, the Mixed Marriages Act, but then secondly, and far more broadly, under the Immorality Act. Okay, so in other words, we're talking about South Africans who fell in love with each other, okay, across artificial, state-designated color boundaries, okay? You got to remember, our people didn't, come separately boxed, okay? We all came together and then were forcibly disaggregated, okay? But that didn't mean that people didn't fall in love, okay? And the immense pain of those stories, the many suicides, in fact, that resulted, I just thought that was the most intimate story of apartheid. How we actually, despite everything, keep falling in love with each other, right? But we're continually forcibly separated. And I found that it was the most difficult story, probably, of my career to investigate. Because it is so intimate, and because there's still so much of a terrible smear against these people. Because the pain was so deep, because it was so close to the bone, it became a very difficult story to interrogate. So the easiest way to do this was to go back to the small Free State town of Excelsior, where in the 1970s there was a celebrated case in which a whole bunch of National Party stalwarts were caught out having sexual relations up to and including children with their domestic workers. It really blew up in the apartheid state's faces, because then the BBC and everybody was in Excelsior, okay, to cover this case. Eventually, Percy Yeto, who was the prosecutor, withdrew the charges. One of the guys, one of the accused, committed suicide because of the pressure, etc., etc. Bearing in mind that the whites and the blacks were co-accused in this, and also bear in mind that there was a power differential there. This was bosses sleeping with their employees, right? And that racial, the added racialized divide. But there were children that came out of this relationship. And so I went down to Excelsior and I interrogated that story. And I think for me, that is the untold South African story, that we are in fact all interrelated, and we've just got to grow up and admit it.
Thank you very, very much, Michael. Round of applause.
Okay, I'll stand for questions.
Yeah,
so I
can
see people.
Please do. Do we have a mic going around? Fantastic.
Oh, right.
Then I shall invite. Let's take a few questions, 3 questions or so, and then we can.
If I prefer a single question answer.
Single question it is.
I get lost in the woods otherwise.
Fantastic.
And I think the audience does too.
I saw our colleague here at the middle table, so let's have your question first, my friend.
Thanks, Leila Groenewald from Sociology. I had 3 questions myself. I'm going to condense them into one. I loved, is it on? I think it's very audible. I loved what you had to say about journalism and the interrogation of the journalist, Michael. As a sociologist, one of the key advances of feminism for me is the fall of the myth of neutrality and universalism. So as a journalist, I'm astounded how my peers still display a kind of fake pride in so-called objectivity. And the way that you were speaking about it as the backstory, for me, that is about the importance of admitting positionality and being transparent about where your agenda comes from. So I'd like to hear your comments as well about objectivity versus transparency about positionality. And I think it links to the issue of universalism. And you were talking a little bit earlier about how the boundaries and the national boundaries and so on fall. But often in this disrupting these sweeping universal claims, isn't the important thing to tell these smaller, localized stories with a sense of place? Those are the ones that tend to disrupt those universal, sweeping generalizations. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, a great set of questions. The question around objectivity, I think it's terrible that journalists still get taught this notion of objective journalism. It's a fiction, okay? Journalists did not fall from the sky. We did not spring fully formed from Krishna's brow. We grew up in our society and we were informed by our parents and our upbringing and the societal pressures and prejudices and likes and dislikes around us. It's crucially important for us to interrogate those. There may not all be negative biases. There may be some positive biases as well, but we need to know who we are when we go into that. As I said, when I train journalists in transitional societies, in particular, I focus on this because it is so important. Look, there are different schools of journalism, and when I train, I talk about the different schools, including and up to the propaganda school. Because in some countries, the propaganda school of journalism is a real thing. It actually exists. If you lived in China or you lived in Iran or Belarus, trust me, you would be very accustomed to the propaganda school of journalism. It is alive and kicking out there. What is the legitimate school of journalism? That's obviously open to debate, but I mean, I lean towards what I call it's kind of an advocacy school, okay? Advocate for a set of, in my world, progressive ethics, okay? But continually reassessing and trying to be as nuanced as possible about what you're trying to convey. And this is where you move away from that universalism, because you're not trying to find some overarching solution or some overarching framework. On the one hand, as you can tell from my earlier talk, I like comparative analysis because I think it's illuminating. It's useful to talk about the progress of South Africa in the light of what happened in Chile, because there are many similarities. If you take that's under apartheid, and under PV and under Pinochet, there's a lot of commonality. The introduction to drinking with ghosts is about that. Today, South Africa today, it's great to compare South Africa to Brazil. Lots of great similarities there as well. Very differentiated population in terms of poverty, in terms of ethnicity, and especially the color gradient in who sits at the top of the pile and who sits at the bottom of the pile. It's very color coded in Brazil. Okay, they didn't call it apartheid there, but they had their own system. They also came out of an autocracy into a democracy relatively recently, and have gone through a dramatic transition in which a socialist government implemented neoliberal reforms. So comparative analysis, these kind of things, that is, I suppose, a certain search for not necessarily an overarching universalism, but resonances internationally. But you do want to look at, obviously, the exceptions to the rule as well, because often those can be more telling. The Communist Party's framing of the apartheid state as colonialism of a special sort is, I guess, one of those examples of an attempt to find the specificity of the nature of what happened here. you know, as compared to maybe other settler colonial societies. Yeah. Did I?
Question over here as well.
Hi, Chad Thomas, investigator at IRS Forensic Investigations and host of the radio show Corruption Busters on Chai FM. With all your years going through journalism, suddenly now we have this whole Gupta scenario where everyone's looking at the Guptas and state capture, but people